On Christmas night, my dad threw me and my grandpa out into the snow like we were nothing to him. Less than 12 hours later, armored SUVs surrounded a roadside motel, and I discovered he wasn't hiding a savings account or a second job. He had been hiding an entire life powerful enough to destroy families. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your city or country in the comments, because it's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And stay with me, because what began as the worst Christmas of my life became something I never could have imagined. My name is Ren Hart, and until that night, I believed I understood my family. We weren't wealthy, but we always managed. Dad worked long hours. Grandpa Otis fixed almost anything with his old toolbox, and I learned early that expensive things mattered less than the people around you. We never had lavish holidays, but Christmas was sacred in our house. We decorated the same worn tree every year, cooked Grandpa's favorite recipes, and exchanged small gifts that meant more than anything money could buy. That Christmas started no differently. Snow drifted past the windows while music played softly in the background. Grandpa teased my dad about burning the dinner rolls, and for a little while, everything felt peaceful. Looking back now, I realize my father barely smiled all evening. He kept checking the time and glancing toward his phone as if he were waiting for something he dreaded. Then his phone rang. The moment he answered, every trace of warmth disappeared from his face. He stepped into the hallway, speaking so quietly I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the color drain from his face. When he returned, he didn't look frightened. He looked like a man who had already made an impossible decision. Without explaining anything, he walked upstairs, grabbed an old duffel bag, stuffed in a few clothes, and tossed it at my feet. "You and Grandpa have to leave. Right now." I laughed because I honestly thought it was some terrible joke. He didn't laugh back. His eyes stayed fixed on the front door as he opened it, letting icy wind rush into the living room. "Get out, Ren," he said, his voice colder than the snow outside. "Don't ask questions. Just go and don't come back." In a matter of seconds, the home that had always been our refuge became the place that cast us into the darkness on Christmas night. Grandpa Otis didn't argue with my father. That was the part one couldn't understand. He simply picked up the duffel bag, rested a hand on my shoulder, and quietly led me down the icy driveway. I kept looking back, expecting Dad to run after us and admit this had all been a terrible mistake. Instead, he stood frozen in the doorway until we disappeared into the falling snow. Then the door closed. The sound echoed louder than I wanted to admit. Neither of us spoke much as we walked to the main road. Christmas lights glowed from neighboring houses, families laughed through bright windows, and children opened presents while I struggled to understand how my own family had fallen apart in less than 10 minutes. After nearly an hour, we found a rundown roadside motel with a faded vacancy sign flickering above the office. The room smelled of old carpet and stale coffee, but it was warm. At that point, warmth was all that mattered. Grandpa sat heavily on the edge of one bed, rubbing his hands together to bring life back into his fingers. I couldn't sit still. "What did we do?" I asked, pacing the room. "Did Dad lose his job? Is he in debt? Is someone making him do this?" Otis looked down at the floor instead of answering. "Grandpa." He sighed but still avoided my eyes. "I don't know what your father plans to tell you." That wasn't an answer. Frustration boiled over. For years, Dad had insisted we couldn't afford vacations, newer cars, or even simple luxuries. He always said keeping life simple mattered more than chasing money. I believed every word because he was my father. Now it felt like every sacrifice had led to this. A cheap motel on Christmas night after being thrown out like strangers. "I spent my whole life defending him," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Every time people said he was distant, I made excuses. Every birthday he missed because of work, every promise he couldn't keep. I defended him." Grandpa finally looked at me. There was sadness in his face, but something else too. Recognition. Not surprise. That single expression unsettled me more than anything Dad had done. "You knew," I said quietly. His silence was all the confirmation I needed. Whatever had happened tonight wasn't sudden. It wasn't random. Somehow, Grandpa had been carrying part of this burden long before I ever realized our family was living inside a secret. As sleep refused to come, I stared at the cracked motel ceiling, wondering whether the father I loved had ever really existed, or whether I'd only known the version he wanted me to see. Morning arrived without bringing any comfort. The snow had stopped, leaving the parking lot covered in a blanket of white that reflected the pale winter sunlight. I barely slept, and neither had Grandpa Otis. We checked out early, hoping a hot breakfast somewhere might help us think more clearly. The small diner across the highway was nearly empty except for a few truck drivers and an elderly couple finishing coffee. It should have felt ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. As we slid into a booth, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Its engine remained running even though no one seemed to get out. At first I told myself I was imagining things. After everything that had happened, I was bound to be paranoid. Still, every time I glanced outside, it was there. The waitress brought our food, but Grandpa barely touched his plate. His attention stayed fixed on the front window. "You've noticed it too," I said. He hesitated before giving a slow nod. A knot tightened in my stomach. A few minutes later, a man wearing a dark coat entered the diner. He scanned the room once before his eyes landed on Grandpa. For the briefest moment, recognition flashed across his face. He quickly looked away and ordered coffee, but the exchange had already happened. I leaned closer. "Who is he?" "I don't know," Grandpa answered. It was the first lie I'd ever caught him telling. When we stepped outside, I refused to let him avoid the conversation. "You know something?" I demanded. "Dad throws us out on Christmas, strangers keep staring at you, and now someone's been sitting outside our motel since sunrise. Tell me what's going on." Grandpa closed his eyes for a second before speaking. "Your father didn't send us away because he stopped loving us." "Then why?" "Because he believed keeping us away from him was the only way to keep us alive." The words hit me harder than the freezing wind. Before I could ask another question, two men approached from opposite sides of the parking lot. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they moved with quiet confidence. One of them looked directly at Grandpa. "Mr. Otis," he said calmly, "you've been difficult to locate." My heart started pounding. "We don't know you," I replied, stepping in front of Grandpa. The second man ignored me completely. "We only need a few answers. Where is Cade?" Hearing my father's name from a complete stranger erased any remaining hope that this was some misunderstanding. Whatever secret my family had been hiding had finally found us. The two men continued walking toward us, their calm expressions somehow making them even more intimidating. Neither one raised his voice or made a sudden move, yet every instinct told me we were in danger. I grabbed Grandpa's arm. "We're leaving." Before we could take more than a few steps, the sharp sound of engines echoed across the parking lot. 3 large black armored SUVs turned into the diner entrance one after another with remarkable precision. They stopped between us and the strangers, forcing everyone else in the parking lot to freeze. Within seconds, several men in dark suits stepped out. Their movements were coordinated, disciplined, and unmistakably professional. One of them spoke into an earpiece before opening the rear door of the middle vehicle. The man who stepped out looked familiar. He was my father. But somehow he wasn't. The worn winter jacket I'd seen him wear for years was gone. In its place was a perfectly tailored dark overcoat, polished shoes, and the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to giving orders instead of taking them. The exhausted man who counted every dollar at the grocery store had vanished. The security team immediately formed around him. "Dad," I whispered. He looked at me with obvious relief before turning toward the two strangers. "We're done here," he said evenly. The men exchanged uneasy glances before backing away without another word. They climbed into their own SUV and disappeared onto the highway. I stared at my father, waiting for someone to explain what I'd just witnessed. "You owe me the truth," I said. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I do." Inside one of the armored vehicles, silence filled the cabin until my father finally spoke. "My name isn't Cade Hart." I felt my chest tighten. "My legal name is Cade Harlan." He paused, choosing each word carefully. "Years ago, I founded one of the largest logistics and defense companies in the country. I walked away from everything, my position, my fortune, even my name. I couldn't process what I was hearing. "No," I said. "You're a mechanic." We struggled to pay bills. We lived in a tiny house. "Because I wanted you to grow up invisible." He looked out the window before meeting my eyes again. "There were people inside my own family willing to kill for control of what I built. After your mother died, I couldn't risk losing you too. Becoming Cade Hart wasn't pretending to be poor. It was the only way I believed I could keep my daughter alive." His confession answered questions I never knew to ask, yet created 100 more. The money didn't shock me nearly as much as the deception. Every birthday, every sacrifice, every story about our ordinary life suddenly felt like another carefully constructed lie. and I no longer knew which memories belonged to my real father and which belonged to the identity he had invented. The convoy took us to a heavily secured estate hidden behind tall iron gates and dense pine trees. Guards checked every vehicle before the gates slowly opened. It looked less like a home and more like a place built to withstand an attack. Cameras covered every entrance, and people wearing earpieces moved through the property with quiet efficiency. None of it felt real. I followed my father inside without saying a word. Every room was elegant but strangely cold, as though comfort had been sacrificed for security years ago. When the staff disappeared, Dad finally turned to Grandpa. "It's time." Those 2 words made my stomach sink. Grandpa slowly lowered himself into a chair, looking far older than he had that morning. He rubbed his hands together before meeting my eyes. "I owe you an apology, Ren." I folded my arms. "You owe me more than that." He nodded. "You're right." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Grandpa took a deep breath. "I wasn't just your grandfather living off retirement. Long before you were born, your father and I built the company together." I stared at him, convinced I'd misheard. "What?" "I invested everything I had. I helped negotiate contracts, found investors, and protected the business during its earliest years. On paper, your father became the public face, but behind the scenes we were partners." Another piece of my childhood collapsed. Every afternoon, I'd watched him repair old lawn mowers in our garage. He complained about aching knees, clipped grocery coupons, and insisted we couldn't waste electricity. None of it matched the man sitting in front of me. "You both lied every single day." "We protected you," Dad answered quietly. "No," I snapped. "You decided I couldn't handle the truth." The room fell silent. Then Dad crossed to a cabinet and removed a small wooden box. He placed it gently on the table before opening it. Inside were photographs I'd never seen. One showed my parents standing beside a glass office tower with Grandpa between them, all 3 smiling proudly. Another captured a company celebration surrounded by people in expensive suits. They looked like strangers wearing the faces of my family. Beneath the photographs rested a delicate silver bracelet. My breath caught instantly. It belonged to my mother. Dad picked it up carefully. "Your mom kept this with her every day." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. "I told you she knew nothing about our past because I wanted you to remember her without this burden," he admitted. "But Nora knew enough to understand why we disappeared. She accepted the risk because protecting you mattered more than keeping our old lives." I closed the box without touching anything else. The greatest betrayal wasn't discovering they had been wealthy. It was realizing the 2 people I trusted most had built an entire lifetime of secrets together, while allowing me to grow up believing I knew my own family, when in truth I had only been living inside the story they chose to tell me. Later that evening, my father asked me to join him in a private study overlooking the snow-covered grounds. A fire burned quietly in the fireplace, but it did nothing to warm the distance between us. He stood beside the window for a long time before finally speaking. "There are parts of this story I've dreaded telling you." I remained silent. He walked to a bookshelf and removed a thick folder filled with documents, newspaper clippings, and photographs. Most of the articles praised the rapid rise of Harlan Global, calling it one of the most influential logistics and defense companies in the country. Others reported investigations that had mysteriously gone nowhere. He opened the folder to a photograph of 2 men. "I want you to meet the reason we disappeared." One man looked almost like my father, only older and harder around the eyes. "That's Ellis Harlan," Dad said. "My half-brother." Beside him stood a younger man with an arrogant smile. "And that's his son, Knox." My father explained that as the company expanded, Ellis quietly began stealing money through shell corporations and fraudulent contracts. Anyone who questioned the numbers suddenly found themselves transferred, pressured into silence, or forced out altogether. By the time Dad uncovered the full scheme, Ellis had already surrounded himself with people willing to protect him. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. "I tried." He slid another document toward me. Witnesses changed their statements. Evidence disappeared. People we trusted were being paid to look the other way. The room seemed to grow heavier with every page. Then he reached for a framed photograph of my mother. The official report said Nora died because of a brake failure. I stared at him. "Official report?" He nodded slowly. "I never believed it was an accident." The words stole the air from my lungs. He explained that only weeks before her death, Mom had noticed financial records that didn't make sense. She encouraged him to keep digging, believing the truth would protect the company. Instead, after she died, the evidence connected to her concerns vanished. I couldn't prove they were responsible, Dad admitted. But I knew staying would eventually get you killed too. That was when he erased the Harlan name, created our new identity, and disappeared with Grandpa and me. Then he told me about the phone call that had shattered Christmas. An old friend inside the company contacted me. Someone sold our location. They knew exactly where we were. Everything suddenly fit together. The panic, the hurried departure, the strangers outside the motel. Yet understanding his reasons didn't erase the pain. So the people hunting us. I whispered. They're your family by blood, Dad replied quietly. I looked down at the photograph of Ellis and Knox. Until yesterday, I thought my family consisted of 3 people struggling to get by. Now I knew there were relatives I had never met who valued power, so much they had destroyed lives to keep it. For 2 days, I barely spoke to my father. Every apology sounded hollow after years of carefully guarded lies. He kept insisting that every decision had been made to protect me, but protection built on deception still leaves scars. I couldn't pretend everything was forgiven simply because I finally knew the truth. On the 3rd morning, Grandpa asked me to meet him in the estate library. Without saying a word, he placed a worn envelope on the table. Inside were copies of old share certificates, handwritten notes from my mother, and a recent legal notice demanding that Grandpa transfer controlling voting rights connected to the original company. They're still after these? I asked. He nodded. Ellis believes I destroyed the originals. He doesn't know I kept everything secure. Then Grandpa showed me one final document. It contained a timeline my father had quietly assembled over the years. Several events surrounding my mother's death matched key moments when Ellis and Knox tightened their grip on the company. There wasn't enough proof to accuse them directly in court, but there were too many coincidences to ignore. Something changed inside me. For days, I'd been focused on my father's betrayal. Now I realized someone else had been tearing our family apart long before Christmas. I found Dad later that afternoon reviewing security reports. I'm still angry, I told him honestly. You don't get to erase that. He lowered the papers and simply listened. But I'm done hiding. He looked at me with surprise. If Ellis and Knox are willing to destroy lives for power, then I don't want another person making decisions for me. No more secrets. No more keeping me in the dark. A faint smile appeared on Grandpa's face as he entered the room. Dad studied me for a long moment before giving a slow nod. Then we'll face this together. For the first time since Christmas, I wasn't acting like someone waiting to be rescued. I was choosing to stand beside my family. Not because they were rich, but because I intended to make the people who had destroyed our lives answer for what they had done. The following week became less about hiding and more about preparing. Dad refused to retaliate through violence, no matter how much anger he carried. Instead, he wanted the truth to destroy Ellis in the only place that mattered, the boardroom and the courtroom. Grandpa disappeared into a secure storage room beneath the estate and returned carrying several weathered boxes. He set them across a large conference table. I hoped these would never be needed, he said quietly. Inside were decades of records. There were handwritten ledgers documenting hidden payments, signed contracts that had never been entered into company files, backup financial statements, and old voice recordings carefully labeled with dates. Grandpa had secretly preserved copies of everything after he began suspecting corruption years earlier. Dad looked through the evidence with visible relief. This is enough to expose the money trail. Grandpa nodded. And enough to prove who benefited every time someone was forced out. Rather than releasing everything immediately, they chose a different strategy. Ellis was hosting the annual Harlan Foundation New Year's Charity Gala, an event attended by executives, investors, politicians, and major donors. Every year, he used the celebration to strengthen his public image as a respected businessman and devoted family leader. Dad looked at me. That's where we end this. I understood immediately. The evidence wouldn't simply appear online. It would be revealed in front of the very people Ellis had spent years impressing. I would attend the gala beside my father and grandfather. Not as the frightened woman who had been abandoned in the snow. Not as someone hiding behind another identity. For the first time, I would walk into the Harlan family's world carrying my real name and the truth they had spent years trying to bury. If Ellis believed he had already won, then New Year's Eve was about to become the night his carefully built empire began collapsing in front of everyone who had ever believed his lies. New Year's Eve arrived with more cameras than I had ever seen in one place. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Everything about the evening was meant to project elegance, influence, and success. To me, it felt like walking into a carefully decorated lie. As I entered beside my father and Grandpa Otis, conversations slowed. Curious eyes followed us across the room. Most people recognized Cade Harlan instantly, and disbelief spread through the crowd as whispers traveled from table to table. He was supposed to be gone. Ellis stood near the stage greeting donors. The smile on his face disappeared the moment he saw us. Knox reacted even faster, pushing through the guests until he stood only a few feet away. "You shouldn't be here," he said coldly. Dad answered without raising his voice. This company was built by people who deserved better. Before Knox could respond, the evening's presentation began. Ellis stepped onto the stage and started thanking supporters while praising the Harlan family's legacy. Then Grandpa calmly walked forward. Every conversation stopped. Taking the microphone, he looked across the silent ballroom. "For years, I believed protecting my granddaughter meant staying quiet," he began. "I was wrong. Silence doesn't protect innocent people. It protects those who abuse power." At his signal, multiple screens around the ballroom came to life. Financial records, signed agreements, archived emails, and voice recordings appeared one after another. Each document connected Ellis and Knox to years of fraudulent transactions and concealed payments. Gasps echoed through the audience. Board members began checking their phones as emergency notifications arrived. Legal counsel had already submitted the evidence to regulators, and company accounts connected to the investigation were being frozen. Ellis desperately tried to stop the presentation, but no one listened anymore. The same executives who had applauded him minutes earlier quietly stepped away. For the first time in years, the truth stood in the center of the room, and no amount of money or influence could convince anyone to look away. Writing. The weeks that followed changed everything. Federal investigators reopened old files, company auditors uncovered even more hidden transactions, and several people who had remained silent for years finally agreed to testify. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Saul Pike abandoned Ellis and Knox, admitting he had concealed documents and helped create fraudulent legal agreements to protect their control of the company. By the end of the investigation, Ellis and Knox had lost their positions, their influence, and the fortune they had spent years building through deception. The empire they had tried so desperately to steal legally returned to my father and Grandpa Otis. People expected that to be the happy ending. It wasn't. One evening, Dad found me standing outside the estate watching the snow melt beneath the early spring sun. "We got everything back," he said quietly. I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I replied. "We didn't." He understood immediately. No court could return the Christmas we lost. No amount of money could replace years spent believing lies were acts of love. No victory could bring my mother home. Dad lowered his head. "I know. For the first time since all of this began, I saw no billionaire, no powerful businessman, and no carefully planned protector. I saw a father who finally understood what his silence had cost. If you want us to be a family again," I told him, "then we start with the truth. No more fake names. No more hidden lives. No more deciding what's best for me without asking." His eyes filled with tears as he nodded. "You have my word." Trust didn't return that day. It returned slowly, through honest conversations, shared meals, and promises that were finally kept. Looking back now, I don't think our greatest victory was reclaiming a company. It was refusing to let greed define what family meant. The people who treated blood as a weapon lost everything they thought made them powerful, while the three of us finally began rebuilding something far more valuable: our trust in one another.